Hello and welcome to episode 86 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about a ton of rumors because while we were away, nothing really happened in the CDL. A lot of players are officially or publicly without teams. They have not signed contracts. Privately, that might not be the case, but at the moment, most of the CDL are not under contract as far as we know. And that's been all right for us. We got to enjoy our holiday weekends. Happy belated 4th of July to anybody that is American, I guess. Bink took quite a bit of time off from work, which I'm sure was quite nice for him. This is the first full work week I've had in like a solid month because of the holidays and the days off I've had. So it feels very weird, but we're back into it. We're back here with the 86th episode of the Ego Chall Podcast. And we're going to talk about a ton of rumors around the CDL and some stuff that may touch on the CDL and Call of Duty in general. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We usually, in the past, haven't really talked too much about rumors and stuff, but right now there just really isn't much else to talk about. So we're going to try to give you guys everything that we've at least heard and, what's going on in the community, keep everybody as up to date as possible. And then, obviously, once stuff officially starts getting announced, pen gets put to paper, all that good stuff, you know where to find us, and we'll be right here ready to talk about it.
I want to start because there are a few ways we could start off this, and I wasn't exactly sure because there was big news, like business legal news that happened today that could and likely will involve Call of Duty in some manner over the next year or two. But I think a lot of the people that come to this podcast probably don't care nearly as much about that as they do about what's happening in ROSTERMANIA, what might be happening. And I think the best place to start would be with Atlanta FaZe and OpTic Texas, because these two teams seem to be linked in ROSTERMANIA, not because they are trading players or engaged in a deal with each other, but it seems, at least from the rumors and reports that we've heard, that Drazah, the LA Thieves player, 2022 world champion, he is reportedly heading to FaZe, and this was after several days, even maybe a few weeks. Obviously, it all kind of blends together in the summer, but it seemed like there was a lot of smoke around the Drazah to OpTic camp, I guess. It seemed to be a prevailing theory that Drazah and Pred would be going to OpTic to join Shotzzy and Dashy. But now it seems that Drazah is actually going to replace Slasher in the Atlanta FaZe roster, and that presumably leaves a spot open next to Pred, Dashy, and Shotzzy and OpTic. And that might end up being filled by Drazah's LAT teammate, Kenny. So whichever way you want to take this first, if you want to talk about Drazah, Kenny, Pred, etc., go for it. But this Atlanta FaZe OpTic Texas stuff seems to be the most interesting thing for me in ROSTERMANIA so far.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, since obviously none of this is confirmed, the biggest question mark for me is if both of these moves come to fruition, where does that leave LAT? I believe I said it on the last episode, because it was after Octane retired. It's kind of like, okay, Octane retired, we got to build around Kenny because, I brought it up, the Hall of Fame for 100 Thieves as an organization. The three founding members of it are Kenny, Octane, and Someday from the League of Legends team. So you lose one of your Hall of Fame franchise cornerstones. There were already reports of Envoy leaving. So it seemed like the most logical thing would be for 100 Thieves to try to lock up Kenny and build around him. But if these moves happen and Kenny goes to OpTic, Drazah goes to Atlanta, that leaves a huge question mark around LAT and what they're going to do. But I think, for each of these moves individually, I think they make both teams just, that much better. I think Drazah to Atlanta FaZe, if you told me that earlier in the season or even last year when Drazah and the Tiny Terrors and FaZe were beefing on Twitter and stuff like that, if you told me they'd be teaming up and joining forces, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But end of the day, a lot of these guys just want to win, and we know that's a fact for the Atlanta FaZe guys. So if they think Drazah is going to give them the best chance to win again, they can probably find a way to put the past behind them and move forward. So I think for the same reason as Drazah, I spoke about LAT's roster construction when they originally signed the four-man team of Octane, Envoy, Drazah, and Kenny, or we talked about it during the Vanguard season and stuff when they were doing role switches and stuff. Drazah and Kenny are both very flexible players, no pun intended for the flex role. But when we don't know what the actual meta of the upcoming game is going to be, players like that can be almost invaluable. If it's a 3-sub game, you can have Drazah running a sub alongside Simp and Abizi, although you could have Cell running a sub as well. But just for the sake of the example here, same thing. If Kenny is playing alongside Pred, Shotzi, and Dashi, as potentially is happening based on rumors, Kenny could be a third sub and run alongside Shotzi and Pred. And at the same point, if it's a 2 AR game, you easily just have Drazah and Kenny respectively running that second AR for each of these two teams. So I think they are really just they're solid players, obviously world champions last year. And they have that sort of I don't think it's necessarily an intangible, but it's just it's the flexibility is the best way to describe it too. Just fit into whatever the meta is needed. And going back to Vanguard, we saw Kenny was on that second AR for a lot of the beginning of the season. They switched Kenny to the sub, and LAT goes back to back, wins the world championship. So they have the potential to both play this crucial role and be that important cog in a potential championship winning lineup. So I would be excited if both of these moves did come to fruition. It would definitely be really juicy storyline, I think, to talk to Drazah and the FaZe guys about how they are able to put the past behind them and that sort of thing. Just actually hearing what they have to say about that. And then for OpTic, I just think Kenny would be a really solid addition in terms of potential leadership too. I don't he's not necessarily like the most veteran player in the league, but he's a pretty vocal player, it seems like, and that could be valuable to a team like this potential OpTic roster that has just a ton of superstar slaying potential. And then if you have like the leadership of Kenny, who is it's not like having the leadership of Aches, where that might come alongside with a lower KD towards the end of Aches' career. But with Kenny, he's still bringing the firepower while corralling the troops and that sort of thing. So I think it obviously would be interesting to see how it all works out, but just on paper and in my head, I think these are both two solid moves if they come to fruition.
Yeah, it's really difficult to rate roster changes in the off season before a game is even we haven't even seen a teaser, so there's really no idea of how whatever the next Call of Duty game is, if there is a next Call of Duty game for this next CDL season. There's been no confirmation about anything regarding that or when it will be. And that to me makes these roster changes so precarious, because if you try to, I guess, get a meta down or like a format down for your team, like, oh, we have these specific roles, that's probably not going to work out as well as you think it would, because it's nice to have some kind of idea of, okay, this player does this, that player does that. But in general, you kind of have to be flexible. Like you said, flexibility becomes invaluable to so many of these teams. And that's why when we were talking last about who we thought FaZe could pick up or should pick up, I put Illy's hat in there just because I'm thinking, okay, he he is flexible in that way that he could be a sub, he could be an AR. And I do think that this is probably the right idea for FaZe, not to go for not a statue AR, because I think that's limiting and kind of putting in a box what Octane and Slasher are. But the idea of that, like, they could really only run AR, like that's what they're known for. I think Celium has proven time and time again that he is adept at running AR, and if they need him to be the main AR of their team, he can do that. So there's no reason to go and get a guy that's their role of a main AR. As for OpTic, it's an interesting pickup because Kenny had a pretty subpar season for his standards. Obviously, he's been one of the best players, I think, in the world for 3-4 years now, since World War II. He was incredible in his rookie season. I believe that was his, rookie season, whatever that is in CWL. But I think it's impressive that they could make this roster, bringing Kenny and Pred. Obviously, Pred by himself is a massive pickup and someone that they should and likely will end up going with. And there's just been a lot of rumors about who that fourth player will be, whether it would be Drazah, whether it would be Kenny, or whether it would be Sib. And I think personally I would go with Sib just because there's so much chemistry between Sib and Pred. And the way I think of it is you're essentially integrating 3 teams when you bring in Kenny and Pred into the roster, because you're bringing in the OpTic team of Shotzi and Dashy. And then you have Pred, who's coming from Seattle, a different system, obviously different expectations or different results in Seattle. And then you're bringing in Kenny, who was a part of LAT, who's had a consistent lineup, teammates, a trio of teammates these past 2 years. And I just think it's harder to integrate 3 teams, where if you picked up Sib and Pred, you'd only be integrating 2, which is OpTic and Seattle. And I would probably go with Sib over Kenny just by himself, because I think the ceiling for Sib is so high. But I also understand that it might not be OpTic's choice, because there's some other stuff that we probably should talk about as well. And I think this leads into it well. When we started ROSTERMANIA, or when we kind of kicked off this post-champs period, we both said, okay, it's pretty much a given that New York's not going to make a roster change. I think we did get it wrong in that we didn't think about 2019 United was a team that actually did break up. Obviously, it was a unique situation because of the switch to the CDL, but 2019 United split up into many different parts, and those players went different ways, to FaZe, Dallas Empire, and Florida, and Chicago. But it's been very rare in the past that a world champion team breaks up before the next event happens. And it appears that it's not going to be a complete breakup where everybody goes to different teams. But reportedly, and this is according to the rotation on Twitter, it appears that Priestahh's contract negotiations with the New York Subliners have hit rocks like the Titanic or something. It looks really shaky in that regard, and it might be ending up with Priestahh not being a part of the Subliners roster next season, which seems unfathomable, because we all assumed, as any logical person would, that the world champions would stick. They would figure out whatever needs to be figured out in terms of contracts, and they would be back together for the next game, because they just won a world championship and they're at the very top. They were the only team to win multiple events this year, and they've won 3. So they won half of the events this season, and it appears that they might not be back together. So what's your reaction about that Priestahh reportedly may not be back in the Subliner starting roster?
Yeah, it's incredibly surprising to me. Obviously, it's hard to judge the situation, without knowing the actual numbers. But whenever it's a contract dispute, the player side, just looking at it from professional sports is a little hard because we have a lot of those numbers actually reported, and you'll get reports like, like Tom Brady and Patriots aren't even close on a deal or something like that, and they'll throw out ballpark numbers and stuff. We don't really have that in the CDL. So it's really tough to know. All we really know is that minimum salary is what now. I think it got bumped up to 58,000 now, something like that. It was 55.
Something like that, yeah.
And I think it reportedly got bumped up again. Regardless, it's below 60,000. And Priestahh didn't have the best season previously the year before here with the Rocker. So it's possible he was on a deal somewhat close to the minimum and was asking for a pretty big raise after, like you said, winning 3 tournaments, including the World Championship. But it's also possible that he was just on, a not close deal to the minimum and wanted a slight bump, and New York isn't looking to spend more, and they think maybe they can get Sib for less money than potentially what Priestahh is asking for. Again, it's really hard to know without the numbers, but just from a player standpoint, it is really interesting that this potentially could happen, and it's really kind of, you got to feel for New York fans that you come off the high of winning a championship and you don't even get a chance to see what the team is capable of doing in the following game. Like, there's so much talk about dynasties and stuff in Call of Duty esports and in esports as a whole. You just completely kill that narrative with a move like this. I guess you could say like the core of New York, if they go on to win a couple more events this year, another world championship, you could make the argument about is it a dynasty and whatnot, because it's the same case with Cole, EG back in Black Ops 2 and Ghost. But nonetheless, just from Priestah's standpoint, it's a really interesting situation. I would love to know more details. We probably never will. But if we ever do get reports on the numbers or anything like that, I think it would be a little bit easier to give a fair assessment on whether it's actually a good or bad move from New York based on what they're offering, what Priestahh wants, etc.
Yeah, we just have better reporting in traditional sports in general, and that makes us a lot more well informed in traditional sports than in esports. Because in esports, especially, we'll just stick to competitive COD. Like, we have these reporters on Twitter that are obviously like giving us what we think is reliable reports, but I think it's also easier in traditional sports because you literally have so many reporters. Like in the NBA, for example, you have Shams, you have Woj, you have Chris Haynes and Mark Stein, etc. And when all of these reporters are reporting on a specific topic, something like, let's say Bradley Beal getting traded to the Suns, or what is happening now is Damian Lillard requesting a trade from the Portland Trailblazers to the Miami Heat. And we're seeing these reporters who have very specific sources, and some of them are kind of playing that into, okay, like, this is what Portland's front office is saying, this is what Damian Lillard's camp is saying, this is what the Miami Heat are saying. So you get a clearer picture of what's going on, and you also get to know exactly who these reporters are kind of reporting on behalf of, and kind of knowing their biases, and that can give you a better idea of what's actually happening in the NBA, at least in terms of free agency or trades. We don't know any of that stuff when it comes to competitive COD. We don't know who the reporters are talking to, really. Like, they could be GMs, they could be players, they could be coaches. We have like literally no idea, and it's very hard to get a gauge of who is leaking this idea that Priestah's contract negotiations are bad. Obviously, if I had to guess, it's somebody on Priestah's side, because there was that report that Priestahh was getting hoed in his contract negotiations, which is very, very funny to think that is a term that is being used in a report. But obviously, because it was reported like that, that makes me think that it was somebody who was either a friend of Priestah's, or it is Priestahh, or it's somebody close to him. And I think ultimately it's very hard to kind of know what's going on with this stuff. We have so little information about the salaries, about how long his contract was or what the terms that New York was offering. I guess this was a renegotiation of his contract, which that was reported that it wasn't just like, I don't know if his contract was up or if they had declined his option. Like there's so much unknown about his contract status and what's being offered and what's being, kind of put on the table on his side, that it's very hard for me to give a straight answer of, okay, this is bad. Like what New York is doing is bad, or what Priestahh is asking for is stupid. He could literally be just asking like, I want a 3-year contract at the minimum. That's a very reasonable thing that he could ask for. Like, I want more security, not necessarily more money, but we have no idea. He could be asking for $300,000 a year, and it's all about the money for him. I don't know. And that makes me think that when people take sides on this kind of stuff and like, oh, Priestahh's agent's bad, or New York is just like completely screwing over their team, it's so hard for me to take one side or the other. It just seems like a really weird situation as a whole. But I will say that Sib is in terms of like in game, Sib does appear to be an upgrade over Priestahh. Whether that translates to the game as in results, that remains to be seen, because we've seen teams kind of replace what we consider glue guys that don't have great stats, that are there to essentially pick up the slack, or they have to do what they have to do essentially. Like they're not gonna pick up a ton of kills. They might not even get the most hill time, but somebody has to be the lowest on the scoreboard. And in terms of New York Subliners this year, it was Priestahh. And we've seen in the past where teams have replaced, their quote unquote worst player and with a much more talented player in theory, and it doesn't end up resulting in better placings. So I'm not really sure. I do think that's really intriguing, and it makes me think like, is OpTic in play for Sib still, or is it just a guarantee that Sib is now going to go to New York? And what happens with Priestahh now if he is out of the Subliners roster? What is kind of the camp's thinking, or the Subliners team? What are they thinking? Because they just won a world championship less than a month ago with this guy, and they were very dominant in doing so. They literally 5-0'd Toronto in the grand finals of champs, and less than a month later, it appears that he might be out and Sib is in. And it's a very interesting story. I have no idea what to really think of it. I think more information would really help. What else do you want to talk about? Did you have anything else as far as New York goes? Because we've talked about Kenny, we've talked about Pred, we've talked about Drazah, and now Sib and Priestahh. I don't know if we mentioned, but Slasher officially left. I don't know if we talked about it, because I know that I pitched the idea of Illy replacing Slasher, but I don't know if that was something that we were talking about because Slasher had left officially. So briefly, we could talk about it, and kind of the rumors that he is. Wasn't it like he's? Maybe I was dreaming these rumors, or maybe I'm just getting him confused with RCDs at this point. But Slasher is a free agent. He's officially a free agent, an unrestricted free agent. So where do you see him going? Do you think there's a spot for him that stands out above the rest?
I think I was talking and forgot that I muted my mic when I started hiccuping. But what I was going to say on the Priestahh topic is, I think I can't remember if it was Jacob Hale or who, but I think somebody on Twitter reported that potentially Slasher and Priestahh are a team of two now. And if you are listening to this episode, or if you came to this episode because you saw my GIF for the tweet with the episode, I tweeted out a GIF from the old 100T Black Ops 4 squad that had Slasher and Priestahh on it. If Drazah and Kenny are off of LAT and that's a blank canvas for them there, I could see them potentially reuniting Slasher and Priestahh on that squad and trying to build around them. Potentially going after a couple young subs or something along those lines, and building from there. So that's something, if that is possibly a team of two, that I could see happening. But just in terms of the New York thing, I think Sib on New York is really scary, and it From a talent perspective, it's, we talk about all the time. There's only so many kills on the map. Um, but just having a talented player like Sib, and not saying Priestahh isn't talented, because I think very highly of him, but I think it opens up some possibilities. One of the things that comes to mind is search and destroy and sniping. We saw Skies having success with the sniper. I'm pretty sure we've seen Hydra with the sniper at certain points, and even Kismet at some points in Vanguard, I feel like. But Sib was pretty much the main sniper on that Seattle team. Was that out of necessity, or is that something he wants to do, and is that going to be something they have to figure out on New York between him and Skies, or is it going to be, who's just the better sniper on that particular game? But it brings out a lot of interesting possibilities too, and even if it's sort of a three sub meta, I think Sib on a sub is super scary, and he's just a really talented Slayer overall. So if New York is to decide to change, I think Sib is one of those players where it might not necessarily be. Well, I don't think it would be a downgrade at all, but it might make it a little bit easier to stomach the thought of not running back that championship winning squad, because Sib is so young, up and coming, and potentially star for them to build around with Hydra even for many years to come. So exciting possibilities again, like you said, though. I wish we knew more, and I think, well, this is a topic we'll probably come back to a couple times throughout the next couple months.
Something we should mention that obviously is it's pretty clear by now, but Seattle is not, they don't have anybody. Like, we're talking about Sib and Pred, almost like foregone conclusions to going to other teams. And Seattle officially announced on July 3rd that they had parted away with like pretty much every person involved with their CDL team. Pred, Sib, Accuracy, and Mac, their starting roster, all announced as unrestricted free agents. Head coach Sam Phoenix Spencer out. General manager Revan, who had only spent a year there, out. S&D coach Equip out. And earlier, I think a week earlier, Gwen, who was their lone substitute for the CDL, he didn't appear in the CDL. He spent the entire year in Challengers. He announced that he was an unrestricted free agent. So nobody's under contract for Seattle. That makes me think that there's so many possibilities for that team, for that franchise, where they want to go next, because these last 2 years have been way better than they had the first 2 years, even though this past year was not very impressive until champs, when they kind of turned it on. They made some big upsets and I believe got top 4, but even so, like, they seem to be in a good place, or they were, and I think there have been rumors that our boy Rambo Ray could be heading to Seattle as a GM and coach, which would be a really interesting decision. And I would love to see what he can do, because obviously I think the way that everything happened with him and OpTic this past year, and getting pushed out with Dashy coming back into the lineup, I think that's a really bad way. And if it were me, it would leave a very sour taste in my mouth, just the way everything happened and kind of the mudslinging that happened earlier in the year. And obviously he's not with OpTic anymore. So I think it would be a really interesting kind of way for Seattle to rebuild after these very strong 2 years. But what do you say? What do you think about Rambo, or the possibility of Seattle rebuilding now that pretty much their entire roster is gone?
Yeah, I would be super excited about the prospect of Rainbow like being that GM and just being given like the reins to say, hey, here, go build the roster you want. Obviously it'd be probably a little more difficult than building a roster on OpTic, but nonetheless, I think Rainbow is just one of the smartest minds in Call of Duty, from a player, former developer, former coach, all that. He knows what he's doing in COD. So I'd be excited to see that roster. I think on the other side of the coin, though, it is kind of interesting that Revan is departing from the team, just in the sense of he was signed to be the GM of a team that kept its roster from the previous year and the previous GM, so he technically didn't have to like make any moves as the general manager. And you could make the argument that the biggest non-move was potentially not selling Pred the OpTic this season and potentially making money for Seattle as opposed to just letting him walk in free agency. Um, but I don't think that would be a reason why Revan would be let go or anything. I think it's just like a clean slate sort of thing for Seattle, and they're going to move forward. So I was interested to see how Seattle would build a team with the mindset of thinking that Revan would stick around. But I think Rambo would do a really good job at building a squad. And I think Revan could too if he's given the opportunity elsewhere as well. But I would be really excited to see what Rambo Ray could do if that's what ends up happening.
Part of the reporting about Rambo was that he might be leading a French-speaking team, and I thought that was interesting just because we don't see a lot of French-speaking teams in general, not a lot of representation among, like obviously France does not have any players aside from Hydra, but he's playing with all North American players. And then there have been obviously a few, Brezzy comes to mind, Whalers in the past, but I believe this was a roster that was supposed to be like Canadian French or French Canadian, excuse me, which would be interesting. Obviously, Rambo, if you've ever heard him talk, he does have an accent, and that's because he is French Canadian. And I don't know if I'm trying to look up this report to see if where I saw it. But it would be an interesting idea just because there's just like that's an unusual way to go about it. And it leads into another topic that I want to talk about because it was something that happened right after our last episode of the Ego Chall podcast. But there was the report that the CDL and Overwatch League teams might be forced to merge. There were talks, according to Dixerto's Jacob Hale, among Activision Blizzard esports executives. They were discussing a mandate that would force teams to unify their brands, which would mean that teams or owners that have teams in the CDL and OWL, they would be forced to merge those brands as one, meaning that the Seattle Surge would have to merge in some way with the Vancouver Titans, who are the Overwatch League team. And that made me just think, would they be leaning into like this Canadian presence if they went with, I think it is a Vancouver-based organization, the owners of the Seattle Surge. Obviously, Vancouver is not anywhere near Quebec or Montreal, but it could just be the Canadian connection could happen. It's not and it's definitely not a definitive thing with this reported mandate, and it wasn't something that they were. It was just kind of being discussed, not necessarily like leaning toward that decision. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that because we did talk briefly, or at least I ranted a little bit about the city-based franchise model, I believe in the last episode or maybe 2 episodes ago, but the idea that it's kind of outdated. We're not in a position anymore at this point with the CDL to really need the city-based model. But what do you think about the possibility of these CDL and OWL teams being forced to merge and create one brand?
I think that would cause more confusion potentially. It's tough to say. So what I'm thinking right off the bat is it could cause confusion because you just from like us on a day-to-day job basis, you could potentially write an article about the LA Gorillas, let's just say, and if you don't have the game title in there right away, then like what LA Gorillas are you talking about? Are you talking about LA Gorillas in the CDL or are you talking about them in the OWL? So I could see some confusion being caused there. People on Twitter, maybe even like they're a fan of LAG and the CDL, and they're going to look up how their team did, and they stumble upon OWL results, and they're like, what the hell is this? So, that's my gut reaction. I could see it working out potentially in terms of just like, growing the fan base in the sense of, potentially some OWL fans would be interested in watching the CDL and vice versa, just because of, if they're a fan of those particular teams and they merge in that way or whatnot. But I think, like you said in the past, the geographical, geolocation based system just hasn't seemed to pick up in esports like, some of these big corporations thought it might. And, the most popular teams aren't necessarily really associated with cities in particular. You think about OpTic, you have OpTic Texas, but everybody thinks of them as OpTic. You have Atlanta FaZe, everybody thinks of them as FaZe, and then even LAT. That's maybe one where like they're kind of associated with Los Angeles more, just because that's really where they've been for most of the time since they've been an actual organization, not counting the original debut there in Black Ops 3 with the prison jerseys. But even at the end of the day, the LAT franchise is 100 Thieves, and those are like the three most popular teams, and they would obviously not have any real issues if the league would switch away from geolocation, right? They would just go back to OpTic Gaming, FaZe Clan, and 100 Thieves. It would be interesting to see what would happen to some of these other teams, like like Minnesota Rocker comes to mind. Like I think we've talked about it before. They've done a really good job as an organization that wasn't previously in esports, doing a good job of coming in and acclimating to the scene, and having stuff like watch parties, press events, and all that sort of stuff, trying to get the community behind them. So that would be interesting to see what they would do from a brand perspective if it was to move away from geolocation. But I don't think that's something that would happen immediately. I think if that is the way the CDL decides to go, it might take like a full year to actually revert that process. And I don't know. It seems like it would be like almost admitting defeat if the CDL was to backtrack on that, right? So I just don't know if it would ever actually happen.
What bugs me about this report, obviously great reporting by Jacob, but at the same time, what is the point? Why would you mandate they create one brand to unify under? They are almost all owned by esports organizations. Have them unify under that brand. The Seattle Surge and Vancouver Titans are owned by the organization that runs Luminosity. Luminosity has history in competitive Call of Duty. They had several good rosters. Octane was a part of one. Formal was a part of one. They've won events. Why do we need to have the Vancouver Titans, or why do we need the Seattle Surge? Just make it Luminosity. It's really not that difficult, and I think Activision just makes it so much more difficult on themselves, because I don't. And if a team wants to keep their city-based franchise, their name. So if Minnesota, because they're connected to the version 1 esports organization that has like a Valorant team, etc. If they want to just be the Minnesota Rocker, because that's the brand that they built over the last 4 years, and it's something, obviously they're owned by the Minnesota Vikings owners. They want to be close to Minnesota or Minneapolis. They want to have that connection. That's fine. I personally don't care. That's like completely up to them. But I just think it's really dumb to force these teams, and they've laxed on it, because in a previous, or at the very beginning, they were saying, well, these teams have to create completely new brands, and then Atlanta FaZe happened, and then OpTic LA happened at the time, and now then Chicago, now Texas. They've been moving all around, and then LA Thieves comes around, and it's just like, what is the point of this? We're at a point now that we don't need it. We never probably needed it after the original format was scrapped, especially because then we're doing events like we used to, where these organizations that are funding a team, they travel to a completely different location and they do an event there. Many of the cities that are quote unquote a part of the CDL, even though they're not really a part of the CDL, they have no representation. They don't have any events. New York didn't even host an event this year. It's the biggest city in the United States, didn't host an event. LA, one of the biggest cities in the United States, didn't host an event. So what's the point? We're just wasting time that these other organizations like OpTic Gaming, FaZe Clan, 100 Thieves, Luminosity, I don't know what other brands that there are. NYXL, I think, is the overarching brand now of the Subliners team. So like these organizations could be building their brand in multiple different games under one brand, that they don't have to kind of divide and conquer of like, oh, we have this, we have the New York Subliners, we have the Excelsior, we have I believe they used to call themselves Andbox. Like they were trying to create like 5 different brands, and I just don't think that ever made sense, but especially now. And we'll talk about it, like even with this heretic stuff, like it just doesn't make sense. We're at a point where we've moved past it, and there's just we don't need any of the city stuff.
Yeah, I think, truthfully, at the beginning of the inception of the CDL, the initial idea of traveling to all these locations and playing like a world circuit or whatever, there was definitely flaws in it, and a lot of people brought that up at the time as well. It was going to be a very hectic travel schedule for all the players and stuff. Like I remember Clay like tweeting like, "Oh, I'm going to go to London 1 week to play a match, and then 2 days later I got to go all the way to LA or something along those lines." But I think from a basic conceptual standpoint, it wasn't necessarily a terrible idea, but the COVID pandemic just absolutely killed any potential for that to actually come to fruition. And just since then, there's just been no recovery in the sense of needing the geolocation aspect of it. And, I look at the LCS and League of Legends esports as a whole. They have one of the most popular games in the world, and they have leagues in North America, Europe, Korea, and China are the biggest ones. And China has like an 18-team league with franchising, and none of those franchises have like Chinese locations. They're all just actual names, and they have sponsors like Billy Gaming, and there's Edward Gaming, and there's Invictus Gaming and stuff like that. LCS, you have Cloud9, Team Liquid, Dignitas, LEC, you got Fnatic and G2. So there's no geolocation in those leagues, and those obviously there's been some issues with the LCS recently, but League Esports as a whole has been pretty successful. And I think even with Valorant now too, this is like the first year of the partnership program between Riot. I don't think they're calling it franchising, but it's essentially franchising without being called franchising. They don't have any geolocation associated with their teams in that as well. So maybe that's just a different in terms of philosophy between Riot and Activision Blizzard, but end of the day, yeah, I think we both see eye to eye here on just the concept. At least, well, you might not agree with the thought of it having any potential success, but I think from the beginning there was like a glimmer of hope that it could be something that panned out in terms of needing the worldwide tour and teams being associated with cities, etc. But I think now it's been proven that just isn't the case with esports and Call of Duty esports as a whole.
I can't remember completely because it was almost 4 years ago, but I think I was in favor of the city, or I wasn't not against. Yeah, I was not against the city-based stuff, just because I like traditional sports. I like the connection to the city or to the state that you're in, but we're like the COD stuff didn't work out in that way. And even after the pandemic, it's just proven that, or it's kind of proven that we don't have like a profitable way of doing this where teams are hosting events, because if it was profitable for them, they would all do it. They would all jump at the opportunity to host these events, and we'd have a bunch of these in-person LAN events in all the different cities. But that's obviously not the case, because there's only been a handful of teams that are actually doing that on a consistent basis. And I just think we could move past it. We can try to do something else and hopefully make it a little more profitable or a little more beneficial to the organizations that are already investing in it, and we don't delay the inevitable, because I think inevitably, whether it's under the CDL or whether the CDL eventually dies and competitive COD has to pick up the pieces and do their own thing again, eventually we're going to just have organizations, and we're going to completely bypass whatever the franchises are currently. I think we all kind of realize that at this point in time. Something I wanted to talk about, though, was kind of related to this, and it's part of the many different question marks that we had heading into the off season. One was about Minnesota, kind of what's happening with them, maybe a potential sale or merger, and then obviously they wiped out their team. Several content creators ended up leaving as well. And then we had, during the season, we had the LA Gorillas, what was going to happen with them, and we still have no idea what's going to happen with the Gorillas and the Guard. I saw that the Guard's Valorant team got promoted to Ascension or whatever, which is incredible. But that even calls into more questions about what's actually going to happen with them. And then one of the other questions was about the Florida Mutineers. And it actually wasn't that big of a question, because we all assumed with a lot of certainty that the Mutineers were going to become the Miami Heretics. There was a report earlier this season that Heretics, who has been formerly a part of competitive Call of Duty, fielding Spanish rosters, that they were going to merge with the Florida Mutineers, and the team franchise was going to become the Miami Heretics. It appears that that might not be the case. There's been very little reporting on it, other than I think that the Florida Mutineers trademarks are still active, and that the Heretics social media page that was supposedly going to be the Miami Heretics social media page, which didn't make any sense, they posted a broken heart. I don't know like what to make of this. Like I think like the social media thing is the least important part of it. It's more of just kind of a funny thing. But the idea that this merger could fall apart seems like really crazy, because it seems like such a certainty. What do you think? What, like, did you make anything of this situation about the Heretics and the Mutineers?
I just, without knowing all the details and stuff, it would definitely be a little bit heartbreaking to not have the Vamos in the league after not having the Vamos in the league and potentially thinking we might have the Vamos in the league. No Vamos is a little heartbreaking. So, jokes aside, I think it would have been really interesting to see them competing in the league, just from in terms of what kind of fandom they would bring, how it would affect viewership, all that stuff that a lot of people like to talk about. But at the end of the day, if the business side of things falls through, we're gonna have to see how things go from that sort of, where they go from here, and if the Mutineers stick around, if they look for another partner to, potentially maybe merge with or whatever. So a lot of things that we still need the details for, and I'm sure, we might get some more reports as some more certainty comes out around this sort of thing. But going to be another situation that we're probably talking about this off season in different variables at different times. So we'll have to see what happens.
On a quite sad note, we have Zero's retirement. July 7th, he announced via Twitter that he was retiring from professional Call of Duty. He posted on Twitter saying, "I apologize to everyone that wanted me to keep going, but it's time I try something different." He expressed interest in becoming a coach or a general manager. Obviously, we've had a few retirements over the past few years, including Octane's notable retirement at the beginning of the off season. We've kind of like, it sucks because Zero is obviously one of the best EU players of all time, or at least one of the most accomplished. He was a part of that Splice roster that won playoffs, was it, in IW, and they were like the first European team to win like a North American event or something like that, or like a major North American event. Obviously, that's very notable. And this year we had our first European world champion in Hydra. So like the European scene, I don't know if you can really say that it's grown because it actually seems to be smaller than usual, but Zero is a part of like that class of like Bance and our boy Jerd. I always loved Jerd, who is just not around anymore, and Marky B and Tommy and all these other players that kind of were at one time, and I have to mention Swanee because that feels like blasphemy not to. But a lot of these European players, or specifically like UK, Irish, English players, they were kind of a legitimized European COD in a way. In North America, they integrated with North American teams and organizations. They became champions at some point, and now we're seeing someone like Hydra, or if you looked at Toronto the last few years, to have like Insight and Kleenex and Cammy and Hixie and all the guys that they've kind of used over the past few years. It seems that Zero did a lot for European COD and Call of Duty in general. So what are your thoughts on his retirement after kind of a few rough years for him in the CDL?
Yeah, I think when I think of Zero, I really go back to that Splice team in IW. Like you said, they were really like the first team in mainstream Call of Duty history to win a championship on North American soil as an EU squad. And I just remember watching that event. I'm like sitting there as someone who was always rooting against the EU COD, being like, I cannot believe an EU team just won in COD. COD is like NA's esport, especially you look at all these other esports where, much more success is seen by European teams, and in League of Legends you got Korea and China, and you know it's not to say Call of Duty is NA's esport, but of any of like the major esports, you could argue that Call of Duty has the most success in terms of having North American players. So um, that's what it always comes back to for me with Zero. I feel like that was really just like a breaking point for him, and something that got his name out there, and then he was able to go on, like you said, and integrate into other teams. I remember him being on Red Reserve. He was on that FaZe team in Black Ops 4, I think, at the end of the season, after like they didn't qualify for the Pro League, and then they got a spot back from Red Reserve or whatever. Um, and then he had that like unfortunate situation where he was supposed to be on London, I believe, for the 1 year of CDL, and then visa issues really like just kept him out, and that kind of derailed the whole season for him. So just a lot of ups and downs for him, but I think in terms of legacy, he left a pretty memorable impact, and especially in terms of you ever have like that trivia question, or you're just thinking about who's on the first North European team to win a major tournament in North America, you're going to go back to that Splice team and think about Zero. So wish him the best going forward. He's a pretty entertaining guy. And he's been on streams with like Zuma and stuff, and pretty funny. So I think he could have a decent future in content creation if that's what he decides to do. But whatever he decides to do, obviously wishing him the best. And yeah, another one bites the dust, but luckily Clay's still kicking. So feels like everybody around him is leaving, but that's going to be the next big one, I think.
Yeah, Clay's gonna outlast Snoopy, which brings me to my next point. No, I mean it does bring me to my next point. After I say, congrats to Zero on a great career, like to be one of the first EU players or part of that first team, that is a meaningful thing, and he should obviously be credited for that and kind of remembered for a pretty great career. Obviously, falling short of like a world championship, but like that's literally like 99% of Call of Duty players, and there's nothing to be ashamed about in that. But I do want to talk about Snoopy real quick because he's like the only player that's actually been confirmed, I think, in the CDL so far for next season. We know, or we really are pretty certain that certain players are not gonna be moving. They're not gonna be going to any other team like Shotzi or Dashy or the FaZe trio, etc. but I believe Snoopy is like the only confirmed player to be re-signed for next year, and so he'll be back with the Boston Breach in the next season, which could start in 2023. It could be 2024. We have literally no idea. Could be a while since we get our next CDL season. But any thoughts on Snoopy officially coming back for the Boston Breach?
Yeah, I think it's a move that makes a ton of sense. Obviously, without really knowing the contract situation, but imagining he signed for the minimum at the end of this year, and Boston was somehow able to just re-sign that. If that was the case, it was probably a very smart move business-wise for Boston, and it gives a young kid an opportunity to really showcase what he's capable of. We've got a small glimpse of him at Champs, and what he's potentially capable of, but it seems like he's like the next man up in terms of the up and coming talent, and it's pretty scary in terms of like he really seemingly came out of nowhere this year, and then like halfway through the season was picked up by Doug Center Martin on the Boston Breach Academy. Next thing you know, he's getting thrown into the fire right away at Champs against OpTic. So very quick progression from him through the challengers pit and whatnot to get to the CDL. But now it's going to be important to see if he's able to capitalize on this opportunity, and from Boston's standpoint, what they do and who they try to surround him with to try to facilitate and grow him as a player. Kind of had talking about Clay, but I know there had been some rumblings that potentially Clay was talking to Boston and stuff like that, and I think that would be a really smart move for both parties. It would make sense for Boston, try to get a veteran in there to mold Snoopy and show him the ropes, all that good stuff, and then it's just another young talented kid around Clayster, who can go out there and drop huge numbers while Clay's just holding lanes behind him and getting his trades and stuff like that. So I think it's a move that makes sense on multiple fronts, but obviously we'll have to wait and see exactly what Boston decides to do to round out the rest of its roster.
A non-CDL related story, but an important one nonetheless. The Federal Trade Commission, their injunction was denied by a federal judge today, which should kind of grease the wheels for this Microsoft Activision Blizzard acquisition that we talked about. It seems like a year ago now. It seems like a really long time. But a $70 billion deal is essentially what's on the line here. And it seems that Activision Blizzard will soon be officially acquired by Microsoft, although I did see a report by Bloomberg that the FTC is leaning toward filing an appeal, which could slow down the process yet again. But let's just say, for the sake of conversation, because neither one of us are lawyers and we don't know when this will actually be completed and whatnot, what do you think the impact would be for Call of Duty and the CDL, or what do you want to happen, I guess, because there's so many possibilities, but what do you think happens, or what do you think would you want to happen if Microsoft does end up buying Activision Blizzard?
I mean, yeah, I really am not too informed on this, and I really, the business side of this stuff isn't necessarily my forte, but I mean, the immediate reaction to me is like you have the two sides of the coin, right? Where like kind of feels like, well, I guess it's three things that could potentially happen is like the most likely scenarios in my mind. The first is, Microsoft acquires Activision Blizzard and it has no impact on the CDL whatsoever. It just continues on its merry way as it is right now. Second would be Microsoft acquires Activision Blizzard and, pours in a ton of support for the CDL, ramps things up 100%, and reinvigorates the CDL and pushes for it harder, more marketing, all that yada yada, and tries to make it more successful. And then the flip side of that is Microsoft acquires Activision Blizzard and just kills the CDL, says we want nothing to do with this, and that's the end of it there. And then I guess from there, Call of Duty Esports could rise from the ashes to, be that non-geolocation-based system of franchising or whatever. But I mean, those are like the three very bare bones outcomes. I think that there could be multiple other outcomes that branch from like each of those categories, but I think that's like the overarching mindset that I have of like what could potentially happen on a very basic level.
It feels like there's got to be some change, and I'm not saying immediately, but if, say, Microsoft was able to officially do this deal by the end of the year, I would say within the following year, so with by the end of 2024, there's probably some change that happens. And maybe it's not a big one, but it just feels like when you have this massive of a deal and there are some very rich and very interested parties in the CDL, the owners that were are probably going to get off the hook for most of their franchising fees and probably don't see a ton of profitability as is. What happens then when they go to Microsoft? Or I don't know how the structure of the organization will be. Is Bobby Kotick going to be there? Because I think he's a big reason why the CDL is here in the first place, because he was able to con all these guys into pouring a bunch of money into something that he knew, like with any brain, he knew that it was not worth $25 million. Like, it's like just logically he knew that, and he did the same thing with the Overwatch League, and that just makes me think that there's got to be some change eventually with the CDL and how they operate. And whatever happens, I'm not sure. I do think that probably the more pressing issues are not even related to the CDL directly, but more just so Call of Duty and whatever Activision Blizzard like subsidiaries there is, like whether they pull, like, which was it was part of the fight with the Federal Trade Commission, was this idea that if Microsoft did buy Activision Blizzard, they could just pull Call of Duty from PlayStation and be like, yeah, sorry, Sony, we're going to put that on Xbox and we're going to put that on Windows, and you guys are never seeing Call of Duty ever again, because Call of Duty is a gigantic game and PlayStation is what you and I play on. That's what a lot of, like, millions of people play Call of Duty on. And obviously that would not be great for Call of Duty in general, because that's limiting how people can play, but it would also kind of shore up all of the financial stuff that I'm sure Microsoft and Activision Blizzard really care about, because Sony's had this kind of exclusivity or early access window with Call of Duty for a while now, since what, Black Ops 3 was the first game that was on PlayStation versus Xbox. I think that AW was the last game to be on Xbox, and they were on like 360, I think, at the very beginning, or maybe at the very end of Ghost, and then it became whatever the series. I don't even remember. Xbox One.
Xbox One, yeah.
So like obviously,
Xbox One was out with Ghost, because I know you could have gotten it Ghost for Xbox One, and I stayed on 360. And then I remember AW was the same thing. I could have gotten it for the one, but I never had a one, so I bought AW for 360, and that like came out of its case like 3 times.
yeah, because you're a big fan of AW, right?
Yeah. I am not.
So I don't know. I don't know how this ends up working out. I hope that, like, the best case scenario would be that the cross play. I would honestly be okay with, like, at least in competitive. I don't really care about the Warzone stuff, but at least in competitive, I'd be okay with Microsoft just killing PC competitive, like, as a whole, and just being like, we're gonna make this a console exclusive thing. Like, to compete on events, compete in events, you have to be on Xbox or you have to be on PlayStation. That would cut down on so many of the cheaters that are kind of ruining, at least, like, the pit is tainted right now because of PC cheating. But if we could just have it on Xbox and PlayStation, that would be perfect, at least competitively. I also think about what happens with Halo, because obviously at one point Halo was bigger than Call of Duty was competitively, and Microsoft and 343 really bungled that. They were literally on USA Network at one point for Halo, and that's like a ridiculous thing to think about. And they've fallen so far that even Halo Infinite did not kind of lift Halo out of the gutter, and Call of Duty is still a bigger esport than Halo by, I think, multitudes still. it makes me think of what's going to happen about Halo and Call of Duty, obviously two of the biggest FPS games of all time under the same umbrella. But yeah, I like I said at the very top, I don't think that neither one of us are legal experts or especially like even gaming legal business stuff. It just is my hope that things will not, completely be ruined by this, but there is a considerable concern, and I think it's a valid one, that Microsoft acquiring Activision Blizzard it could be very bad for kind of the consumer as a whole, just because Microsoft is a gigantic company. When you have $70 billion to throw around to buy another gigantic company, you know that you're massive and you have a lot of control. And hopefully that control is okay. It doesn't end up ruining it, but I think that's something that we should keep an eye on. I don't know if we have anything else to talk about. We've kind of went over all of the rumors and reports as far as I know. Maybe I'm forgetting something. We did discuss a lot. There was, we kind of obviously jumped around from topic to topic, but I think we covered anything that you think we did not catch.
Nope, I think we got everything. And especially like we said at the beginning, a lot of the stuff that we talked about outside of Snoopy officially being released, and like Seattle officially releasing its whole, or Snoopy being signed, sorry, Seattle officially releasing everybody, Zero announcing his retirement. That stuff's all official, but a lot of the other stuff, OpTic, FaZe, New York Subliners, all that stuff is unconfirmed at this point and just rumors. So, I think we hit everything that's been going around the TL that we would usually talk about for the most part. So we should be good on that front.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be back next week or 2 weeks or something. Like we want to, not completely go off the grid, but obviously there's not a ton to talk about. We have kind of bantered back and forth about some potential ideas for off-season content as far as topics go, and I think a few of those have legs, and we could definitely fill an hour of just things that we like or dislike, or obviously if you're listening to this right now and there literally hasn't been any news in the past like week or two, you probably care what we think or what we feel about competitive COD in some way. So it probably wouldn't be a stretch to think that you guys would listen to us just ranting about pretty random CDL or COD competitive COD stuff. So we'll make sure to bring that to you guys in the off season. Obviously, especially after like all the roster changes or most of the roster changes are announced, that's when the real dead period will begin, because we could get a bunch of roster news in the next month, but then we probably still have like 3 months until the actual release of the game, and it probably wouldn't be too wise of us to just completely go dark for 3 months. So we'll make sure to keep you guys updated. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I put out an update on the community tab on the 4th of July, just telling people like, hey, we're not going to be doing a podcast this week because of the holiday, and obviously there's not a ton to talk about. I also tweeted about it, so make sure to follow us on Twitter. He's at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Preston Byers. The podcast Twitter, which we don't really use, is at Ego Chall Podcast, but you could use it if you want, or if you could follow it if you want. And the YouTube is great. I told Bink, and he already knew this, but we're close to 100 subscribers on our YouTube channel, which is amazing. I think we're at 87 at the time that we're recording this. Obviously, we had a ton of people listening to our last few podcasts, the audio versions, which is incredible, and we really appreciate all the support that you guys have gave us all season long, and really all the last 3 seasons that we've been covering the CDL. So we really appreciate that. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. I think we have we had a few reviews over the past few months. That's always nice. A lot of positive feedback, which is always nice for my fragile ego to hear. But yeah, thank you all for listening, and I'll pass it over to Bink now.
Yep, I don't got much because, like I said, they don't have really much that we know is going to happen or whatever. So, thank you guys as always for the support. We'll see you around whenever the next time we go live is. And like Preston said, if you want to stay up to date with us and stay in tune with when we could potentially go live, Twitter is the best place to do that. So give us a follow over there, and yeah, you can join us for the live show, or if you guys are listening after the fact, we obviously appreciate that too. And any support you guys have, we're very appreciative of it. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.